I couldn't sleep. Not for hours. Not for days. Every night, that cry echoed through my walls, a heart-wrenching wail that cut through the silence of the night like a knife. The sound made my chest tighten, pulling me from my sleep, forcing me to lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, the cry was louder, more desperate. And for the first time in all these months, it hit me hard. It was my daughter, Clara. My precious daughter who had once been full of life, laughter, and dreams. Now all she did was cry. Cry and suffer. It felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end. It had been months since the doctors gave up on her, and still nothing seemed to change. I had watched her slowly fade away, her body wasting, her spirit sinking deeper with each passing day. The doctors said it was hopeless. They called it a terminal illness, something that couldn't be fixed no matter how much money I threw at it. I tried everything. Different hospitals, different doctors, different medicines. But none of it worked. Clara kept getting worse, and I kept feeling more and more helpless. Each night, I would sit beside her, praying that somehow she would wake up and be the girl she used to be. But no. Each night, it was the same. She would cry, tremble, and whisper things that made no sense. The sound of her pain filled the air, a sound I could never escape. The walls of our small apartment didn't block it out. It seemed to seep through, reaching my ears no matter where I was. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to make her better. But how? The doctors had no answer. And truthfully, neither did I. I was lost, just like she was. I wanted to believe there was a way out, but deep down I didn't. Then one evening, Mariam knocked on my door. She was always there, always smiling, always telling me about God and how He could help me. I never paid her much mind. God? I never used God. My life had taught me that much. When my wife died, when Kara fell ill, where was God? I never saw any sign of Him. So I pushed Mariam away, time after time, but she never gave up. She kept coming, week after week. She smiled at me like she always did, but tonight there was something different in her eyes, something serious. Mr. Eze, I heard Clara crying. I know it's not easy, but please let me pray for her, she said, her voice soft, full of concern. I looked at her. I wanted to shut the door in her face. I didn't need her prayers, didn't need her God. But for some reason, I couldn't. There was something in her eyes that made me pause. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, or maybe it was the pain in my heart that I couldn't ignore anymore. I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the room where Clara lay, her frail body barely moving on the bed. The cry had stopped for a moment, but I could feel the tension in the air. Mariam didn't say a word. She simply sat beside Clara, took her hand, and closed her eyes. I didn't believe in God. I never had. But as I watched Mariam kneeling beside my daughter, whispering quietly to herself, something strange began to happen. It was like a stillness filled the room, something I couldn't explain. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it. I stood at the door, unsure of what to do. I had never seen Mariam like this before. She wasn't just praying. She was believing. I couldn't see what she saw, but for some reason, I stayed. I stayed and watched her, wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this than I had ever imagined. And then, Clara stared. Her hand twitched in Mariam's grasp. I blinked, thinking it was just my imagination. But then it happened again. Clara's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days, she looked at me, really looked at me. I felt my heart skip a beat. Could it be? Could this really be happening? I held my breath as Mariam continued to pray, her voice calm, unwavering. Clara's breathing slowed, the tension in her body easing little by little. I didn't know what to think. It was too much, too sudden, too strange. But something inside me, something deep in my chest began to hope. Hope I hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that something, it gave me the courage to believe, just for a moment, that maybe things could change. Maybe God was real after all.
The next day, Clara was different. It wasn't anything big, nothing that could make you believe in miracles at first sight, but there was a change. She wasn't as pale as the day before, and when I walked into the room, she looked at me, really looked at me. Her eyes had some light in them, a little spark that had been missing for so long. She didn't look so lost anymore, and for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while. Hope. Mariam kept coming. Every day, she would visit, sitting by Clara's bedside and talking to her like she was just fine. I watched her closely, wondering if she was just wasting her time. After all, Clara had been sick for so long, no amount of prayers could fix what the doctor said was unfixable. But I couldn't deny what I had seen. Clara was improving, even if it was in small, almost unnoticeable ways. She was sitting up a little longer, her eyes clearer, and she had even smiled at me one morning. A real smile, not the kind of weak grin she used to give when she had the strength. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Maybe this prayer thing wasn't just a waste of time after all. I still didn't understand what Mariam believed in. I didn't get how she could be so sure that something as simple as talking to an invisible God could change anything. But I couldn't deny the changes I was seeing in my daughter. Maybe there was something to it. One evening, Mariam came in as usual, kneeling by Clara's side. I was sitting in my chair, the same chair I'd spent countless hours in, watching my daughter slowly fade away. But today I noticed something I hadn't before. I wasn't as scared as I used to be. I wasn't drowning in my fear and worry. Maybe because I saw Clara getting better. Maybe it was because Mariam had this way of making me believe, even just a little. The room was still, silent, except for Mariam's soft whispers. I didn't know exactly what she was saying, but I could tell she was asking for healing. She was asking for something I never thought I would ever ask for, the impossible. The doctors had said Clara would never get better, but Mariam kept coming, and Clara kept improving, piece by piece. On the fourth day after Mariam started praying, I noticed Clara standing up. It was only for a few seconds, but she stood. I rushed over to her, my heart pounding, not knowing what to think. Clara's legs wobbled, but she held herself up. She looked at me, eyes wide, like she had never seen me before. "I'm not in pain anymore, Daddy," she said. Her voice was weak, but it was there. She hadn't spoken much in the last few months. The sound of her voice felt like music to my ears. Tears filled my eyes as I helped her back to the bed, not knowing what to say. I didn't know if this was a miracle or just something temporary, But I couldn't ignore the fact that Clara was better. I didn't know how it was happening, but it was. The doctors had said she wouldn't survive much longer, but now she was standing, talking, and showing signs of life that I hadn't seen in months. The change wasn't huge, but it was enough. Enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about life, about hope, and about faith. The same faith Mariam had been trying to show me, even when I didn't believe a word of it. For the first time in ages, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe my daughter wasn't beyond saving. Maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this prayer thing than I had ever imagined.
The morning came, and Clara was sitting up in bed, her face brighter, her eyes clearer. She had eaten her first full meal in months, and the color in her cheeks had returned. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The change in her was nothing short of miraculous. But deep down, I was still holding my breath. I kept thinking it was too good to be true. Maybe this was just a phase, a brief moment of relief before the illness took over again. I couldn't let myself believe too much, not yet. But the doctors had told me that Clara would never get better. They had said there was no cure for her illness, and no medicine in the world could save her. They had prepared me for the worst. I had watched them shake their heads, their faces full of pity, as they told me to make peace with the inevitable. I had already planned her funeral in my mind, thinking about what I would say at her grave. But now she was sitting up, talking, and even laughing a little. It was too much for me to grasp. Mariam came over as usual. She smiled at me when she saw Clara sitting up, but there was a look of quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She had been telling me that God was healing Clara, that he was working in ways I couldn't understand. I had been skeptical, but now I couldn't deny what I was seeing. She wasn't fully well, but she was better, and that was more than I had ever hoped for. I looked at Clara, then at Mariam, and I knew what I had to do. I had to take her to the hospital. If Clara was really getting better, the doctors had to see it. They had to explain it. I didn't believe in miracles, but I didn't have any other way to explain what was happening to her. So I called the hospital and arranged an emergency appointment. I didn't know if they would even let us in, but I didn't care. I had to know what was going on. Clara was already dressed, her small frame standing on shaky legs, but determined to walk. I helped her into the car, my heart racing as I drove through the streets, the sounds of Clara's laughter in the back seat filling the car like a song. It was strange, almost like I was in a dream where everything was changing in ways I hadn't expected. When we arrived at the hospital, the doctors were shocked to see Clara. They had expected to see a pale, frail girl wasting away from her illness. But instead they saw a girl who looked like she was slowly coming back to life. They ran tests, took blood samples, and hooked her up to machines, all while exchanging confused glances. One of the doctors, a middle-aged woman with glasses, looked at me with wide eyes. This can't be possible," she said softly. "Her vitals are normal. There's no sign of the disease. Her body, it's healing." I felt my chest tighten. The words didn't make sense. How could this be happening? How could Clara, who had been given only weeks to live, be standing here today, healthy and full of life? The doctors ran more tests, but the results were the same. Clara was healing. The illness, the disease that had been slowly killing her was gone. It was as if it had never existed. The doctor left the room to consult with her colleagues, and I stood there in silence, staring at my daughter. She was smiling, her small hands gripping mine as if she couldn't believe it either. I looked at Mariam, who was quietly watching us. Mariam had said God would heal Clara, that I just needed to believe. And now, as I stood in that hospital room, watching a doctor struggle to explain what was happening, I realized she had been right. God had healed my daughter. There was no other explanation for it. I didn't know how to feel. I was overwhelmed with emotions, relief, joy, disbelief, and even fear. What did this mean? For me, for Clara, for everything I thought I knew. As I sat down next to Clara, I looked at Mariam again. She was watching me closely, her eyes full of hope. She didn't say anything, but I knew what she was thinking. She had known all along that this was possible, that God could do what doctors couldn't. But I had been stubborn to believe. And now, as the doctors came back into the room, still in shock, I knew that everything was about to change. The doctors couldn't explain it. They couldn't understand what had happened. But the tests were clear. Clara was no longer sick. The illness that had been eating away at her body for months was gone. Her blood pressure was normal, her heart rate steady, and the disease was undetectable. The doctors looked at each other in disbelief, their minds racing for an explanation, but none came. I stood in the room watching them, still unable to grasp what was happening. The machines, the monitors, the constant beeping, all of it seemed so ordinary now, as if Clara had never been sick. The same girl who had been on death's doorstep just days ago was now sitting up, smiling, talking to the doctors like nothing was wrong. She was laughing with them, asking questions about her recovery, and I watched her with a mixture of awe and confusion. Mariam was standing in the corner of the room, quietly observing. She had told me time and time again that God could heal, that God would heal Clara, but I hadn't believed her. Not really. I thought it was all just words, empty promises, something people say to make themselves feel better when there's no real hope left. But now I didn't know what to think. The doctors had no answers. I had no answers. The doctor who had been leading Clara's treatment stepped forward, looking at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. She shook her head, still trying to process the results in her mind. Mr. Eze, I don't know how to explain this. We've been treating Clara for months, and we've seen no improvement. But now, she's completely well. I don't know what happened, but whatever it is, it's a miracle. I blinked, the word hanging in the air like a weight. Miracle. It didn't make sense. This wasn't possible. I looked at Clara, still sitting on the bed, her eyes sparkling with life. She looked like a different person. No, she was a different person. The change in her was too big to ignore. She wasn't the girl I had been sitting beside for months, helpless and broken. She was whole again. She was alive. I turned to Mariam, my mind reeling. The questions I had been avoiding now flooded my thoughts. How? Why? Was it really God? Could God really do something like this? All the doubts I had buried, all the anger I had carried with me for so long came rushing to the surface. Mariam, I said, my voice thick with emotion. What did you do? What happened to my daughter? She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at me, her eyes soft and full of compassion. She had been so patient with me all this time, waiting for me to come around, waiting for me to see what she had seen all along. I didn't do anything, Mr. Eze. It was God. It was always God. You just needed to believe. Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had been so stubborn, so angry at God for taking my wife, for letting Clara suffer. I had closed myself off from everything, convinced that there was no God, that the pain I had experienced was proof of that. But now, standing here, looking at Clara, looking at the doctors, I couldn't deny what was in front of me. The doubt that had held me captive for so long began to crumble. The belief I had rejected so many times now felt impossible to ignore. But I still couldn't fully accept it. I couldn't just give in so easily, not after everything I had been through. There were too many questions, too much pain. Why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why didn't he help me before? Why didn't he save Clara sooner? Mariam stepped forward, her voice gentle. I don't know, Mr. Eze. I don't have all the answers. But I do know this. God doesn't promise that we won't go through pain, but He promises to be with us through it. He sees us, even in our darkest moments. And sometimes He works in ways we don't understand. I stared at her, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. The anger that had built up inside me for so long, the hurt, the betrayal I had felt from life, from God, was still there. It wasn't gone. But now, there was something else. A flicker of hope. A seed of belief that had been planted deep inside me, even if I wasn't ready to fully embrace it. The doctor came back into the room, her face full of questions and confusion. Mr. Eze, we've run every test we can think of. Clara is fine. She's healthy. I don't know how, but she's healed. The word healed hung in the air, and for the first time in my life, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something to this faith thing after all.
Days passed, and Clara continued to improve. It was like watching someone slowly waking up from a long, painful sleep. She was eating, talking, laughing, and slowly regaining strength. The pale, lifeless girl I had watched for months was now vibrant and full of life. It didn't make sense. How could someone go from near death to being perfectly healthy? The doctors were still baffled, still running tests, but each time they checked, there was no sign of the illness. It was gone. But even as I watched my daughter come back to life, I couldn't shake the questions. I couldn't ignore the anger that still lingered in my heart. God had healed Clara, but He had allowed her to suffer for so long. He had allowed me to watch my daughter wither away, unable to do anything. He had taken my wife, leaving me alone in this world, filled with pain and confusion. Why? Why had God allowed it all to happen? One evening, as I sat beside Clara's bed, I couldn't keep the questions inside anymore. The pain, the grief, the anger that had been buried for so long came pouring out. I looked at Mariam, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, her eyes filled with compassion, but also with a gentle knowing. Mariam, I don't understand. I don't understand why God allowed Clara to suffer. Why did He let me go through all that pain? I watched her get weaker and weaker. I watched her cry, and I couldn't help her. And now, when I almost gave up, He heals her. Why? Mariam didn't answer immediately. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes soft. After a long silence, she spoke. I don't have all the answers, Mr. Eze. I wish I did. But what I do know is that God doesn't cause our pain. He doesn't cause our suffering, but He promises to be with us in it. And sometimes, when we're in the deepest part of the storm, we don't see Him, we don't feel Him, but He's there. He's always there. I looked at her, my chest tight. She was right. I had spent so much time focusing on my anger, focusing on my loss, that I had forgotten about the bigger picture. Maybe I had been so focused on the pain that I couldn't see the love and the healing that were also there.
Maybe I had been looking for answers in the wrong places. I've never believed in God, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I've been angry at him for so long. I blamed him for everything. Mariam nodded, her eyes full of understanding. I know. But you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to understand everything. You just have to trust. Trust. The word felt foreign to me, like something I had never allowed myself to do. I had always been in control. I had always tried to solve everything on my own. But now, as I watched Clara, my daughter who had been so close to death, sitting up and smiling, I realized that maybe it wasn't about control. Maybe it was about trust. I don't know if I can believe in God like you do, I said slowly. But I'm starting to see that there's something I've been missing. Maybe I don't have to understand everything to believe. Maybe I just need to trust that He's there, even when I can't see Him. Mariam smiled gently. That's a start, Mr. Easy. That's all any of us can do. And for the first time in my life, I felt a shift, a tiny spark of belief. It wasn't fully formed, and it didn't have all the answers, but it was something. It was enough for me to start letting go of my anger, enough for me to start forgiving the past. In the days that followed, I found myself praying for the first time, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I didn't have the perfect words, but I spoke from my heart. I thanked God for healing Clara. I asked for peace. And even though I didn't have all the answers, I found a quiet peace inside me that I had never felt before. As Clara continued to heal, I realized that I had been given a second chance, not just for her, but for me. God had given me a chance to start over, to let go of the anger and pain that had been holding me captive for so long. And as I looked at Clara, my daughter who had been so close to death, sitting up and smiling, I knew that this wasn't just her miracle. It was mine too. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the beginning of something new. I didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in years, I was ready to take that first step.